History's strange, it's alien, and it won't give us what we would like to have.
O'Galley Electric brings you hour 3 of this Tuesday morning. It's the 25th of August, 2026. Glad you're with us here on WMMB. Tuesday's 8 o'clock hour devoted most generally to Dave Does History. As Dave Bowman's been with us throughout the day, this hour belongs to him as he takes us through some aspect of our history every Tuesday here. Dave, we're talking Lewis and Clark today. A little diversion from the Revolution.
Just a little one. It was the Lewis and Clark expedition fascinates me at the core of discovery. One of our favorite vacation places is a little place called Long Beach, Washington. And from our hotel room where we stay, you can look out to the Pacific Ocean, probably half a mile away, and you see this just tree. This is one tree standing there. And that tree bears the carving. It's actually a copy now because the original was lost, but it bore the carving made by the Lewis and Clark expedition that this was the point that we reached the Pacific Ocean. We're going home. And it's one of those things that I enjoy walking to. That whole area is covered with Lewis and Clark information and parks and that kind of stuff. Is where I bought this book, Bill, this 3-inch thick book, the Lewis and Clark expedition day by day. And
have you read it all?
Not all of it, no. I tried to read it. It was a long
trip, Dave.
Yes, it really was. And I think what fascinates me about this is I go to Long Beach and I look at this tree that's a half mile away and it's got a path that goes to it. And I live in the 21st century and it's a fairly easy walk for me. But in 1805, there was no path here.
Right.
This was just sand dunes and grasslands and the whole 9 yards. And you think about the whole country that way now. In 1805, there was a little area in southwest Montana that today is completely underwater. We built a dam and made it under a reservoir. But it was there, underneath where this reservoir is now, that this week in 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition hit perhaps their most dangerous moment. Maybe not dangerous, but in the sense of we've run out of river. Where do we go now? And most importantly, how do we get there?
And we find out as Dave Does History continues in a minute on WMMB. Headline at BillMick.com this morning, sports, religion, and history. You click on that, and you've got links to Dave Bowman, Dave Does History, and What the Frock podcast there for you. As today we're exploring Lewis and Clark, and in particular at the moment, what's going on with Sacagawea. Dave, where are we at?
So the so-called Corps of Discovery, and that's what they named the expedition, that's the actual name of the expedition, had followed the Missouri River basically as far as it could take them. Now, they had crossed the Continental Divide and entered southwest Montana, northeast, kind of eastern Idaho, that area there. And they should have been excited. They had reached the backbone of the continent. And they had a problem, though. The expedition had been operating on this assumption, and you know what happens when you assume, that somewhere beyond the headwaters of the Missouri River, they would find a river that flowed west that would carry them to the Pacific Ocean. Now, maybe they might have to, trek a short way across the mountains, followed by another relatively easy journey by water. But that assumption was rapidly collapsing. Lewis was looking ahead, and all they could see was mountain range after mountain range after mountain range marching off into the horizon. The Shoshone Indians were telling him that the rivers around here are difficult, dangerous, and in some places basically impossible to navigate, which could explain why Evel Knievel decided to jump the Snake River. The Corps was going to need horses. They don't need boats, they need horses. And without horses, they can't carry their supplies across those mountains. And without the Shoshones' cooperation, they're not going to get those horses, and they may have to turn back. When they finally arrived at the camp with the canoes and stuff like that on August 17th, 1805, Clark arrived with a fellow by the name of Toussaint Charbonneau and Sacagawea. Now, Sacagawea had been telling him for days that they were getting close to the country of her people. She was Shoshone, and she was recognizing landmarks. She knew the rivers. She understood that somewhere nearby they might actually encounter the Shoshone from whom she had been taken many years earlier. As the party approaches the camp, Sacagawea will notice a Shoshone woman who is coming through the crowd. She immediately recognizes her. They had been childhood companions, and both had been captured during the same tribal raid that had taken them away. The journalists that were there described them as embracing with extraordinary emotion. Imagine this a moment. Sacagawea had been returned to the world from which she had been violently removed years earlier. She had been about 12 years old, by the way, when she was taken, probably somewhere around 1800. Several Shoshone had been killed, while Sacagawea and other children were taken east to the other tribes' villages near the Missouri River. By the time Lewis and Clark meet her at Fort Mandan, she's living with her French-Canadian trader partner, Charbonneau, and she's pregnant with their child. Now, after all these years of separation, she's home again. She was perhaps 17 years old. She's carrying her son, Jean-Baptiste, who Clark nicknamed Pomp, but the most famous reunion is yet to come. Lewis and Clark need to hold a formal council with the Shoshone. They need to sit down with the chief, a guy by the name of Cameahwait, and Sacagawea is brought in to interpret this communication. She sits down, she begins preparing to translate when she looks over at the chief and realizes, hey, I know that guy. Not only does she know that guy, that chief, Cameahwait, is her brother.
Wow.
The expedition simply identifies her as his brother, but that's how this relationship is entered to us. She immediately jumps up, she runs to him, she embraces him, throws her blanket around him, they begin crying. Lewis notes that the chief was also moved, but a little less outwardly so, because, this is a diplomatic conference, right? Yeah. We don't do that.
Chiefs don't cry.
Yeah, we usually think of Sacagawea as this historical symbol. She's on monuments, paintings, she's on the dollar coin. But that scene at camp, what's known as Camp Fortunate, reminds us that she was just a young girl who had been kidnapped as a child, and this expedition, this Corps of Discovery, brings her back into the presence of people she probably assumed she would never see again. She also began learning what happened during her absence. Some members of her family had died. According to Clark's account, she learned that her immediate family was dead, with the exception of 2 brothers and the son of her eldest sister. She would later bring that boy into her own care. It's an intensely personal homecoming, but it also changes the political situation facing Lewis and Clark. When they arrived, they need horses. The Shoshone are very suspicious of them, and they have good reason to be so. The Shoshone are vulnerable to attacks from neighboring peoples. Lewis is asking them to, help. Some Shoshone were afraid that Lewis might be leading them into ambushes if they helped out. Then Clark arrives. Sacagawea recognizes the chief. It didn't immediately resolve every disagreement that they had. The Shoshone still had their own fears, their own needs, their own interests. They were not simply waiting, to help out this American expedition. But Sacagawea's presence gave Lewis and Clark something they desperately needed: credibility.
Yeah,
here was a
family
woman
in the mix. That's got to be a huge change here. That's fantastic.
Yes, it does. Here was a woman from the Shoshone tribes traveling with these strangers. Her husband is one of their interpreters. Her infant is with her. And that relationship helps create that bridge of trust at exactly the moment when the expedition could not have proceeded without Shoshone assistance. The mechanics of this
the horses for a second, Dave. Those are assets for those folks, whether they be military or otherwise. They are assets that they need.
Yes, they are. They're incredible. Now imagine this scene for just a moment, Bill. This is one of the most important negotiations in American history. We don't think of it this way, but we're talking about Lewis and Clark and the Shoshone. The problem is the translation is weird. Lewis and Clark speak English to one of their privates. The private translates the English into the French for Mr. Charbonneau. Charbonneau translates the French into the other tribe language, the Hidatsa for Sacagawea, and she translates that into Shoshone for Cameahwait. And to answer back, it has to go through that entire sequence in reverse.
It's like playing the telephone game. How do you know that you got it right all the way through?
4 languages, 3 interpreters, and anyone that's played that telephone game knows that this is a strange thing, isn't it?
That's complex, yeah.
But ultimately, it's important. And Lewis and Clark will succeed because they understand something that leaders don't always understand. Command is not the same thing as knowledge. Authority might place you in charge, might make you an attorney general, but it doesn't make you self-sufficient. And Sacagawea, who has sometimes been described as the guide, that's too simple. She's the one that really made that human connection, which is why they named this place Camp Fortunate, because they get the horses that they need to go on.
What a break that was, that she, as the wife of one of their co-explorers, is family, and it turned the whole thing around. It's all about family. We're back in moments.
Our weekly dive into history. Dave Bowman joins us on Bill Mick Live.
O'Galley Electric bringing you the hour. Dave Bowman bringing you Dave Does History. And so Lewis, Clark, Sacagawea, and company have made it to her tribe and her family, actually, and they're jumping in to help out. Where are we going next, Dave?
One of the more remarkable things to us today is, we look at a map of the United States today and we go, oh, well, this makes sense. It's and plus we have interstate highways that go everywhere and U.S. highways that go everywhere.
Those didn't come along till Eisenhower, though.
No. And even the U.S. highways didn't come along until the 30s and 40s. So it's a different world, and it's hard for us to accept that there were no satellites. There's no maps, Bill. The maps that Lewis and Clark are using to go west are based on some old Spanish maps back during the 1600s that assumed, and that's the big problem, they assumed that there was a big river that went west from the mountains, from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. All they got to do is find that river and everything will be great. And that's the whole plan. So was there something that gave those maps credibility? No.
Okay.
But that was the theory that, well, there must be one. And in fact, as they cross the Continental Divide and they descend, into the first valleys there, the Camp Fortunate, they actually see something that explains them. Now, keep in mind, the Pacific Ocean is not unknown at this time. It's just that land between, basically what's Missouri and the Pacific coast really isn't known at all. But they do know what a salmon is. And they know something about the lifestyle of a salmon. And as they're walking through this area, they see salmon in the creeks, which means that the salmon had to come from the Pacific Ocean to get here, right? I mean, it's a logical conclusion.
Sure.
So this proves to them in their minds that there must be a giant river like the Missouri or the Mississippi that will take us to the west. The Shoshone, who they're sitting around with, keep telling them, your direction is right. The problem is your river. They begin to send out small reconnaissance party to determine whether or not these small rivers that they're finding can carry them west to the Columbia River. And eventually they find one called the Limhi, which joins a much larger river known as today as the Salmon River. And they thought, well, this is promising. There's salmon in that river. If we can just build some canoes, we can get back on plan, and the original idea here can be salvaged. The Shoshone, however, keep explaining to Mr. Clark that, no. According to Cameahwait and his people, the river ahead passes through mountains that are so steep that travel along its banks is extremely difficult. And if you've ever been there, you know this. The current is very swift. The channel is full of rocks. The river cannot be safely navigated. And Clark had learned by this point that native geographical information has become more reliable than the maps and, more importantly, the theories that they had carried from the East in these old Spanish maps.
Again, recognizing they don't have the knowledge and they need to get it.
Which is, of course, why they're out here in the first place.
So as they're gathering this knowledge and getting ready to make this happen, you said they'd sent out some expeditions, taking a look, and some scouting parties, I guess.
Clark went out looking at, because, the Shoshone, through this translation system that travels through 4 languages, had told him, no, that's not going to work. But being, typical American, he had to go see for himself. And so he took a small party out, and they went and looked downstream at these rivers. And what they found were exactly what the Shoshone had said. The mountains were right up against the rivers. There's no beach line to travel on. He would write that the country was so difficult that it was almost incredible that horses could pass through it at all. It was amazing that the Shoshone, with their horses that didn't even have iron shoes, managed to do it, but they weren't going to be able to. The river itself was very fast, too shallow for boats. Rocks are scattered through the bed. There's no timber to even build canoes in the first place. Even if they managed to construct boats, the rapids and the currents would smash those boats into pieces.
Wow.
So on August 24th, 1805, they reached the conclusion. The river is too rapid, it's too rocky to navigate. The mountains are too high and too steep and far too broken that following the river by land is impossible. So what do? We can not continue downriver, either by land or water, or we can't climb these mountains. That's going to get us killed. For more than a year, this entire expedition had organized all of its movements around rivers. They had boats to carry weapons, tools, scientific instruments, clothing, trade goods, medicine, and written records. Even when the Missouri River was too shallow, the men could drag the canoes. But now the river could no longer be their road. The expedition would have to become an overland pack train. Boats have to be abandoned or cached. Essential supplies would have to be selected. Everything would have to be carried from here on out. And those horses would have to be purchased, loaded, and managed. And they would need guides. And all of this transformation is occurring while food is becoming dangerously scarce. The hunters are having very great difficulty finding anything to eat. The Shoshone are hungry as well, by the way. And their vulnerability was one of the reasons why Cameahwait had hesitated to remain in the area. His people were heavily dependent on salmon, the roots, the berries, whatever game they could take, but they also lived under the constant threat of attacks from other tribes that possessed firearms. On August 22nd, one of the expedition's most capable hunters, a guy by the name of George Gerard, returned to Lewis with a remarkable story. He had encountered a small Shoshone camp while traveling. There he met two men, a boy and several women. He dismounted, allowed his horse to graze. After communicating with signs, he walked away from the camp to retrieve his horse, but he made a mistake, like Dr. McCoy. He left his rifle behind. So
Oops.
He had to chase the guy that took his rifle. He followed them for roughly 10 miles. And eventually he managed to convince them that, and look, I'm not trying to hurt you. I just need to get my gun back. And there you go. The Shoshone man had enough presence of mind to open the rifle's firing pan, dump out the powder and stuff like that. But his whole idea here was that, look, I found their supply dump and we can get it. And that's, look, cooperation, mistrust exists at the same time. Sacagawea's reunion with her brother did not magically erase all the cultural misunderstanding. The Core and the Shoshone needed one another, but each side is also trying to survive. And that's part of the issue here. These men need to get these supplies so that they can continue on with this. And if they don't get them, they're not going to be able to. But that doesn't erase the mistrust that the Shoshone naturally have. And ultimately, they're going to get this worked out. Reality dismantled the plan that they had brought from the East. They could have abandoned the whole thing. But the mission remains the Pacific Ocean. The route, the transportation would have to change.
Before there were headlines, there were hard choices. You're listening to Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
O'Galley Electric bringing you the hour, and you want to weigh in with Dave as we bring this edition of Dave Does History to a close. 321-768-1240. So hard choices for Lewis and Clark for sure, as they can't go the way they wanted to go, Dave, and now they got to change a plan.
Well, they're going the way they want to go. They're just not going the way they want to go. They wanted to go by river.
Way I meant method, but yeah, I got you. Yeah.
But they know they're going to go west. I mean, that's the whole purpose of this expedition, is to reach the Pacific Ocean. This is what makes this whole week at Camp Fortunate so important. They don't just encounter an unexpected obstacle. They discover that one of the most central geographical assumptions behind the entire expedition is completely wrong. I can't emphasize this enough. These old Spanish maps that were made, again, back in the 15 and 1600s, just assumed that there would be a giant river. And as we know, there ain't. For more than a year now, this Corps of Discovery has been a river expedition. The entire organization, equipment, daily routine have all revolved around the boats. The men know how to paddle. They know how to pole. They know how to sail. They even know how to tow their vessels. But now they don't have that anymore. The boats are essentially useless. Lewis understands that the Corps cannot carry everything across the mountains. Even after they get the horses from the Shoshone, there will not be enough pack animals for all of the supplies that they have. Some equipment is going to have to be left behind. Now, this requires difficult decisions. What are we going to need when we go into the mountains? What can we leave here that can be recovered when we're coming back? What can we afford to lose permanently? How much ammunition are we going to need? How much medicine? How much clothing or trade merchandise can each horse carry? They begin to reorganize the expedition. And on August 18th, Clark sends a scouting party out to the west. And while they're doing that, Lewis opens the stores and all the baggage. He inspects everything. He lays it out to be aired out. He begins separating all the supplies into parcels suitable for transportation by horse. They make leather thongs to strap these things to them. They are getting ready to go overland. They have to rebuild their entire transportation system, and keep in mind, they have to do it with what they have there. They can't, go down to the I forget the name of the Cabela's and get whatever they need. They've got to make it. At the same time, they're bargaining for more horses. They purchased 3 more horses from the Shoshone in exchange for, you ready? An officer's uniform coat, some leggings, handkerchiefs, knives, and other trade goods. Other members of the Corps obtain another horse with an old checkered shirt and a knife. Both sides believe that they've made a very good bargain. The Americans need the horses more than they need the spare clothing, and the Shoshone value the manufactured goods that are difficult for them to obtain. So by now, by the 21st of August, they have the baggage, they have the saddles, and they have the harnesses, and they're ready to march. But they still have too much crap. So they start digging for a cache near the camp. That's essentially an underground storage chamber, carefully constructed and concealed so that you can leave equipment behind without advertising its location.
Mm-hmm.
The Corps had used these before. They would use them again. Lewis says, hey, wait till after dark before you put stuff in there, because even though we're getting along with the Shoshone, we don't necessarily want them to know what we're leaving behind or even where we're leaving it. Doesn't mean that they distrust the Shoshone, but the problem is they're leaving guns, powders, and tools, which, of course, the Indians would like to have because they're tired of getting, killed and raided by these other tribes. The men work very quietly and very quickly in the darkness. They put all this equipment in the ground, and then they got to figure out what to do with the canoes. They take the canoes over to a pond. They pull the plugs out of the bottom of them, they put rocks in them, and they sink them to the bottom of these ponds. And the thinking here, Bill, is, remember, this is 1805, okay? They hope that the submerging of the canoes will protect them from grass fires, which frequently burn across the plains, even in 1805. The Indians, the Shoshone, promised not to damage them. Lewis assumes that raising the heavy waterlogged vessels would require more work than it's worth, so they're not going to do it. These men have spent months getting ready to do this stuff, and this expedition is changing right in front of them. The camp arrived, the Corps arrived at Camp Fortunate as travelers. As river travelers. They're going to leave here as mountain travelers. And it tells us everything we need to know about Lewis and Clark as leaders. They don't treat everything they've carried as equally important. They distinguish between what is essential to the mission and what has merely been useful up to this point. That's a distinction that's never easy. If you've ever moved, you know what I'm talking about. Sure. It's hard. People become attached to methods that have worked before. But the problem is reality gets in the way sometimes. Keeping the boats would have meant stopping. Abandoning the boats, at least temporarily, makes it possible to continue. There's a little moment in this week that gives us a glimpse into Meriwether Lewis himself. August 18th is his 31st birthday. I don't know what you were doing at 31, but I was not walking across America. There's no birthday celebration recorded in the journal. There's no cake, of course, and no big feast. Lewis spends the morning trading for horses, preparing the baggage, and making the equipment ready for the next stage of journey, but he does take a moment to reflect on his life. And he writes in his journal that having reached the age of 31, he has probably lived about half the years allotted to him. And he looks back on his life and he concludes that he has, quote, done very little to advance human happiness or contribute to the knowledge of future generations, unquote. That's a remarkable judgment from a man standing near the Continental Divide on one of the most ambitious expeditions in American history. Remember, he had already served in the Army. He had been Thomas Jefferson's private secretary. He'd helped plan this expedition. He'd assembled the whole thing. And now he thinks, I don't think I've done enough. He writes that from here on out, he's going to attempt to live for mankind. Knowing what's going to happen later, that becomes especially poignant. In 4 years, he'll be dead at 35. His death, one of the most enduring controversies, by the way, in American history. The official conclusion is suicide, but many historians believe that the surviving evidence might challenge that conclusion. But 4 years before, he had stood at Camp Fortunate in southwest Montana, wondering if he had done enough. He's not simply the confident explorer marching across the continent. He's introspective. He's ambitious. He's dissatisfied with himself, and he's intensely aware of time. Even in the midst of an expedition that would secure his place in history, he wonders if he's done enough. Then he closes the journal and gets back to work because, we got to do this. On August 24th, the transformation becomes real. They purchase 3 more mules and a horse, and they get ready to go. And on August 25th, they give the order to move, and out they go, beginning to cross the way. They don't go a long way. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I cross the country these days, I drive for 10, 12 hours. I cover, 1,000 miles? They managed to cover 6 that first day before they camp for the night and go on their way. The larger lesson, though, of this week at Camp Fortunate is that they arrived there with a plan based on an understanding of Western geography that was completely wrong. The Western rivers are not connected to the Missouri. The Salmon River was not a useful highway. The mountains are higher, wider, steeper, more numerous than they expected. They could have just treated that discovery as a complete failure. They could have turned back and said, well, we can't do it. But instead, they distinguished between the mission and the method. They could have said, we can't keep going. But instead, they decided to change their method. And that's what leaders do when things turn against them. Yes, they had Sacagawea with the human connection. They had the Shoshone with their knowledge and assistance. But unless Lewis and Clark made the decision to change the method, we might not be talking today about the Lewis and Clark expedition at all, other than as a failure. And maybe in that case, Lewis is right, and his life really doesn't live up to what it needs to be. But the lesson we need to take forward today is the mission is more important than the method. And that's what Lewis and Clark had decided that day, 1805, this week.
321-768-1240 if you want in with Dave. We pick it up in 1 minute on WMMB. Let's get to your calls with Dave Bowman on this Tuesday morning. Good morning. You're up with Dave. What are you thinking here?
Hey, guys. This is a guy in Palm Bay. I was wondering if did you just say Sacagawea continued with them with her partner, her husband, onward to the west, or did she stay there with the tribe? And also, it wonders, the realization of not having a river and stuff and having to go. If he didn't go into some sort of depression, if he maybe killed himself 4 years later over the change.
Interesting thoughts, Keith. Dave, what do you see there?
No, Sacagawea continues on as she crosses the Bitterroot Mountains. She actually goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and she becomes kind of a symbol of peace as her presence with the native indigenous tribes that are there kind of gives them that feeling of, hey, we're okay. She'll spend the winter at Fort Clatsop here on the West Coast, down by the Deception Pass in that area. And she even guides the returning journey back all the way to, she doesn't actually leave the expedition until 1806, near Washburn, North Dakota, when they're not really dependent on her anymore. And so on she goes. I can't comment on whether, the mental state of Captain Lewis. Clearly he was an introspective and thoughtful kind of guy, and I appreciate that. Most historians have concluded that his death was suicide. There are some who will argue that, and I'm sure Candace Owens would demand to see the high fidelity video of it. But the bottom line is, he accomplished something important, and he did so because he was willing to be flexible, as we would have said.
Dave, as I travel my native West Virginia, that George Washington explored in much the same way before the country became the country. I look at parts of it today and wonder, how did they cross it? How did he navigate and map any of that? That had to be so tough.
I still walk out to that tree in Long Beach and think, this is hard for me. I don't know how they did it, but they did.
Interesting story. And Dave plans to be off next Tuesday. We shall progress as we do when he's not here, but that's not very often, thankfully. Thank you to Galley Electric. They made this hour possible. Dave Bowman, sure appreciate that. And we'll see you either next Tuesday or next time.
We'll see you then.
Good job, sir. And we'll see you all in the morning for Wide Open Wednesday.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.